Wyoming Territory, 1882. The wind howled low across the sagebrush as Levi Ashford reined in his horse at the edge of Dry Creek, the sun burning red behind the hills like an old wound. He spotted her just off the bank, a woman face down in the dust, one arm twisted beneath her. Her dress was torn at the hem and stained with blood. For a moment he thought she might be dead. But then she moved barely, just a twitch of her fingers in the dirt. Levi dropped from his horse before his boots even touched the ground. "Miss!" His voice caught in his throat. He knelt beside her, his shadow falling over her face. "Can you hear me?" Her eyelids fluttered, and she looked up at him, eyes the color of a storm rolling in fast. Even through the pain they were steady, strong. He had never seen anyone look at him like that, like she was holding herself together just to meet his gaze. He slid an arm under her back and lifted her gently, careful not to jar her leg. It was twisted at the ankle, badly bruised. She gasped but did not cry out. "I've got you," he said, voice low. "You're safe." She tried to speak, but her voice came out cracked. I fell. My horse spooked. I think it broke my ankle." "I can see that," he said. "Name's Levi Ashford. My place is about 6 miles north. You think you can hold on if I carry you to my horse?" She nodded once. Her face was pale, lips dry. "Clementine," she whispered. "Clementine Dorsey." His arms tightened around her. "All right, Clementine. Let's get you out of here." He carried her across the creek, the water barely up to his boots. She was light, but every step he took made her wince. He talked to her as he walked, just to keep her awake, asked where she was from, what she was doing out here alone. She answered in short breaths. "I was headed to Cheyenne," she said, "looking for work, as a seamstress. I left my brother's house in Laramie. He got married. Things changed." Levi helped her into the saddle, then mounted up behind her, one arm around her waist to keep her steady. "You should have waited for the stage," he said. "I did not have money for the fare." He frowned. She was too proud to ask for help, and too brave for her own good. But he did not say any of that. He just nudged his horse north, keeping her close against his chest. By the time they reached his ranch, dusk was falling. The cabin sat low against the hills, smoke curling up from the chimney. He slid down first, then took her in his arms again, carrying her inside like she weighed nothing. "I'll get you cleaned up," he said. "Then I'll wrap that ankle." She gripped his sleeve. "Thank you." He paused. Her fingers were cold, but her eyes still held that strength, that grit. "You are welcome," he said softly. Inside, the fire was warm. He set her on the cot near the hearth, then lit a lantern and fetched the basin. He worked in silence, cutting away the torn fabric at her ankle, cleaning the blood, wrapping it tight. She winced but did not cry. When he looked up to check on her, she was watching him. "You do this often?" she asked. He gave a short laugh. "No. I wrangle cattle and break horses. Never had to fix up a woman before." She smiled faintly. "You are doing fine." He looked down at her foot. "You will not be walking on this for a while." Her smile faded. "I do not have anywhere to go." "You do now," he said, too quick. He cleared his throat. "I mean, until you are healed. You can stay here. I have a spare room. No one else lives here." She nodded slowly. "All right." He stood, rubbing the back of his neck. "You hungry? I could eat." Levi roasted beans and cornbread over the fire. She leaned back against the pillows and watched him the whole time, eyes sharp. There was a quiet between them, but it was not uncomfortable. When he handed her the plate, her fingers brushed his. Warm, solid. "This is good," she said after the first bite. He shrugged. "I have had worse." She looked around the cabin. It was neat but plain. A rifle hung above the door. A shelf of books sat near the window. "You live alone?" "Since my father passed. My mother died when I was 12. It is just me now." She was quiet for a long time. Then, "I am sorry." He sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "What about your folks?" "My mother died young. My father drank himself into prison. My brother raised me best he could." "That why you left?" She hesitated. "His wife did not want me there. Said I was too much trouble. I worked odd jobs until I saved enough to head east. But I never made it." "You did now," he said. "You made it here." Their eyes met again. Something passed between them, something unspoken, but strong. He saw it again, that fire in her. Even hurt, even lost, she held her chin high. "Thank you, Levi," she said softly, "for stopping, for carrying me." "I did not have a choice," he said almost to himself. "I saw you, and I could not ride away." She reached out and laid her hand over his. "You did not." His fingers closed around hers, rough and warm. He did not let go. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. But inside, the silence was full not of absence, but of something beginning to grow. Something steady, something real. The next morning brought a hush over the land, quiet and pale, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Levi stepped out into the yard before sunrise, boots crunching in the frost-hardened dirt. The horses stood still in the corral, steam rising from their nostrils. He moved among them without a word, checking hooves and feed, movements practiced and calm. Inside, Clementine sat propped on pillows, her hands busy with a needle and thread. She worked in silence, piecing together a worn sleeve from one of Levi's shirts she'd found folded at the bottom of a trunk. When he came back in, his coat dusted with cold, she didn't look up right away. "You mend quiet," he said, hanging his hat by the door. She tied off the thread and set the patchwork aside. "I've done enough of it to know noise doesn't help." He crouched beside the hearth, feeding a few pine logs to the coals. "You always sew for men you just met?" "No," she said, leaning back with a sigh. "Only the ones who carry me 6 miles through a riverbed." He glanced at her, then gave a slow nod. "Fair." He stood again, brushing wood dust from his palms. "I'll ride into town tomorrow, get you more proper things." Her brow creased. "That's not necessary. You've got one dress," he said, "and it's torn." She folded the shirt gently in her lap. "I don't want to be a burden." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved to the table, poured water from the tin kettle into 2 mugs. He handed her one, waited until she took it. "I don't see it that way," he said. "You're hurt. You need rest, not shame." She looked at him over the rim of the mug. "You speak plain. Not much use in anything else." She took a sip. "You always live like this?" He sat across from her, stretching his legs out. "It suits me. Land's quiet. Work's honest. No neighbors." He shook his head. "Closest is a widow 4 miles west. Doesn't care for company." Clementine traced the rim of the mug with her thumb. "I grew up in a mining camp. Noise was constant. Men arguing, carts clanging, boots always stomping. I used to dream about a place where I couldn't hear anything but wind." "Well," he said, "you found one." A log popped in the fire. She looked into the flame, her voice softer now. "I used to think if I stayed quiet, I'd disappear. That nobody'd notice me enough to send me away." Levi leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "Didn't work, did it?" She shook her head. "No. Quiet didn't make me invisible. It just made me lonely." He didn't reply at first. Then, "Some folks think being alone and being lonely are the same. But they're not." She met his eyes. "No, they're not." They sat that way for a long time, the fire casting flickers across the walls. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of pine and snow-damp earth. Levi watched her fingers, how steady they were despite the bruises. She was built from thread and grit, that much he knew now. Not delicate, durable. He rose to stoke the fire again, then turned to her. You up for a bit of fresh air later? I can bring the rocker out front. Set you on the porch if you'd like. Her eyes lit briefly, not with a smile, but something quieter. I'd like that. He nodded. All right. As he moved past her, she reached out, touched the edge of his sleeve. Levi. He stopped. Thank you. For not asking more than I can give. He turned his hand, let it rest lightly over hers. You've given plenty. She didn't pull away. Neither did he. Late afternoon light settled gold across the porch as Levi carried the rocking chair out, setting it near the edge where the sun pooled warm against the boards. He'd lined the seat with a wool blanket earlier, and when he returned inside, Clementine was already drawing her shawl around her shoulders. She didn't ask for help, but when her foot brushed the floor, her breath hitched sharp. He stepped in without a word, lifting her as if he had done it 100 times before. Outside, the breeze stirred the tall grass and sent a hawk wheeling high over the ridge. Levi eased her into the chair and crouched beside her, adjusting the blanket so it wouldn't tug at her ankle. When he stood again, she tilted her face toward the light. You can smell the pine from here, she said, voice quiet but steady. Snow's sitting in the branches up that way, he said. Melt comes late. Keeps the scent close. She turned her head. You always notice things like that? Only since I stopped needing to notice anything else. Her gaze lingered on him, thoughtful. You ever think about leaving this place? He leaned on the porch rail, crossing his arms. I used to. After my father died, I figured I might head east. Thought maybe I'd find something different. But the land kept calling. I'd ride out a while, then come back without meaning to. Clementine looked out over the field, where the grass rippled like water. I used to think staying somewhere too long meant you'd end up stuck. But maybe it just means you've found something worth holding. He didn't answer, but the wind moved between them, carrying the scent of wood smoke and distant water. After a while, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small cloth bundle. She unwrapped it slowly, revealing a pair of iron sewing scissors, the blades dulled at the tips. These were my mother's, she said. Last thing she gave me before the fever took her. I've carried them everywhere since. Even when I had nowhere to use them. Levi's brow furrowed. You almost lost them in that fall. I know, she said, running her thumb along the handle. I checked my saddlebag before I passed out. I didn't care about the money I left behind. Just these. He nodded once. You make things last. She looked at him, that same unflinching steadiness he'd seen the day he found her. I try to, she said. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. Levi stepped back inside and returned with a tin cup, steam curling from the top. Mint and willow bark, he said, offering it to her. Helps with swelling. She took it, her fingers brushing his again. This time, neither of them looked away. I don't know what kind of man you think you are, she said, but you've got a way of making silence feel like it means something. He exhaled slowly, as if he hadn't known he was holding his breath. I'm not much for talking just to fill the air. I don't want that, she said. I just want to feel safe in the quiet. He sat beside her, not close enough to touch, but near enough that the warmth of his presence settled around her like the blanket on her lap. You'll be able to walk again in a few weeks, he said. After that, you'll have choices. She turned to him. And what if I've already made one? He looked at her fully then. his jaw tightening not with fear, but with the weight of something real. Then I'd be a fool not to meet you halfway. The porch creaked beneath them as the breeze picked up again, lifting the edge of her shawl. She didn't pull it tighter. Instead, she let the wind move through her, and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she had to brace against anything. Levi reached out, slow and sure, and laid his hand over hers. She turned hers to meet his, palm to palm, fingers curling around his like they'd been waiting for this moment. And still, neither of them said another word. They didn't need to. The sun kept falling, and the hawk circled wider, and the cabin behind them stood steady against the coming dark. The morning passed in a hush. Levi worked the fence line, hammering replacement rails where the elk had broken through during the last storm. The rhythm of it lift, brace, drive the nail steadied his thoughts. He didn't look up toward the cabin, but the weight of knowing she was there, behind the cedar walls, settled in his chest like a steady heat. When he returned near midday, Clementine was seated at the table, sleeves rolled, a spool of coarse thread unwinding through her fingers. She looked up from the shirt she was reforging another of his, this one with a torn cuff, and set it aside. Someone rode past, she said, chin tilting toward the window. Didn't stop, just followed the ridge. Levi stood still, hand on the doorframe. What did he look like? Hard to say. Blue coat, maybe military. Horse was tired. They weren't in a hurry. He poured a dipper of water and drank half before answering. Could have been headed for Carter's post. Cavalry scouts pass now and then. Clementine leaned back slightly, the tension in her shoulders less from fear than from memory. Back in Laramie, soldiers used to come through town with wild eyes and empty hands. I kept my head down. Even then, they stared. Levi set down the dipper. You don't have to do that here. She nodded once, then looked toward the open window. You ever fight? During the raids, yeah, he said. Wasn't the army, but we rode alongside him. Neighbors needed defending. Did you ever regret it? He rested his back against the wall, arms crossed. Sometimes. Mostly when I think about what I didn't understand then. What I lumped together just because I was told to. Her gaze didn't flinch. You believe in right and wrong? I believe in what you do when no one's looking. She let that sit between them a moment before folding the shirt and setting it aside. You read much. He glanced at the shelf. Enough to know I miss half the meaning. I could read aloud to you if you'd like, she said, her tone even. My mother taught me how to speak clear, even when my hands were shaking. He looked at her, the offer plain and without performance. I'd like that. Outside, the wind had shifted again, dry and warm now, coming up from the south. Clementine gathered the book from the shelf, a worn copy of Emerson's essays, and opened to a page without ceremony. She read slowly, letting the words breathe. Levi sat at the far end of the table, elbows resting on his thighs, head bowed not in prayer but in attention. The words filled the space between them, not like a sermon or lecture, but like water drawn from a well neither of them had known was there. When she finished the page, she lowered the book. You thinking something? I didn't know words could feel like work and rest at the same time. She smiled faintly, not with pride, but with understanding. My mother used to say the truth doesn't shout. They sat in the quiet again, but it wasn't idle. It was full of the kind of stillness that only comes when two people are turning toward each other without needing to name it. Levi stood finally and crossed the room to the stove. There's stew from last night. I'll warm it. Clementine folded her hands in her lap. I could help, if I sat near. He glanced over. You steady enough? She nodded. I know how to stir a pot. He dragged a chair close to the stove and helped her settle in. She took the wooden spoon and moved it through the pot with slow, practiced motions. It's funny, she said, how doing something small can make you feel like yourself again. He leaned a hip against the counter. You ever think about having your own shop? She looked over at him, surprised. What makes you ask? You've got the hands for it. And the head. She stirred a moment more. It was always a dream. A little room with windows and bolts of fabric lined up by color. Folks bringing in torn coats and leaving with something whole. Well, he said, watching her. Dreams change when they've got room to grow. She didn't answer right away. Then she looked up at him, her eyes clear. I don't think I want to go east anymore. He didn't move. What do you want? She set the spoon down, turned her hands palm up in her lap. To stay where I'm seen and not just looked at. Levi stepped closer and she didn't lean back. Then you're already there. Their eyes held, steady and quiet, like everything else in the room had gone still to let them speak without words. And in that space between breath and answer, something shifted. Not sudden, not loud, just certain, like a gate swung open, not forced but invited. A week passed before Clementine could stand bearing weight on her ankle. Levi had carved a stout cane from pine, sanded smooth where her hand would rest. He kept close as she tested it for the first time outside the cabin, one hand hovering at her back, not pressing, just ready. She limped across the packed earth slowly, eyes narrowed against the brightness. The garden plot lay dormant nearby, the last of the snow melted into dark, ready soil. You ever put anything in that ground? She asked, pausing to rest. Turnips once. They came up bitter, Levi said, folding his arms. Figured cattle feed was a better return. Clementine shifted her weight. You've got sun. You've got water. Just needs someone with a steadier hand. He looked at her, quiet for a breath. That's something you'd want? I know how to keep a garden. And I don't like idle hands. Levi nodded once. Then we'll plant something. They didn't say anything more, but that evening, he brought in seed sacks from the barn, beans, squash, corn leftovers from a neighbor who hadn't made it through the last winter. Clementine sorted them by touch, slipping kernels and husks into jars, her fingers sure even when her steps weren't. By mid-April, the long thaw had softened the ridge. Levi hitched the wagon and helped Clementine onto the bench beside him. The trip to town was slow. The road rutted and churned from meltwater. But she didn't complain. She watched the land, eyes sharp on the spread of color returning to the plains, blue flax at the edges, yellow primrose along the creeks. As they reached the outskirts of town, she drew her shawl tighter, her mouth set firm. Levi glanced at her, then reached down and took her hand. No question in the gesture. At the general store, he traded for muslin and calico, a trimming knife, beeswax, and a pair of shears with sharper points than the ones she'd carried from Laramie. He stepped back while she spoke with the storekeeper, her voice calm and precise as she asked after thread weights and bobbins. No one stared. No one asked where she'd come from. On the ride back, she sat with a bolt of soft blue fabric across her knees, fingers brushing its edges. I never thought I'd feel useful again, she said. Levi kept his eyes on the road. You never stopped being. Back at the cabin, she took over the corner near the window, cleared of its old stack of tools and coils of saddle rope. Levi hung a shelf for her threads, and she tacked a strip of burlap to the wall to pin patterns. She worked with quiet determination, tracing lines, cutting with care. He didn't interrupt, but he watched how she leaned forward when she was concentrating, how her lips parted slightly when measuring. One night, as wind rattled the eaves and the fire settled into coals, she stood behind him while he was reading and pressed her hands to his shoulders. He stilled, then reached up and covered her right hand with his. I've been thinking, she said. He waited. I never had a place that let me keep myself. I was always bending to fit. You don't have to hear. His voice was low. I know. She tightened her fingers. That's why I want to stay. Not just for the house or the quiet, but for you. He turned, slow and certain. I haven't asked, because I didn't want you to feel beholden. I don't, she said. But I do feel something else. His thumb brushed the edge of her palm. Say it. I love you, Levi Ashford. He stood then and kissed her, not fast, not hesitant. Just sure, just right. In the weeks that followed, they settled into a rhythm. She stitched shirts for neighbors and embroidered simple flourishes on rough linens. He dug fence posts and repaired the roof before the spring rains. They planted the garden together, her seated on a barrel as she pressed seeds into the soil he turned. She laughed when he wiped dirt across his brow, and he smiled when she hummed tunelessly as she worked. They married beneath the cottonwoods on a Sunday in June, with the widow from the West Ridge bearing witness and the storekeeper's wife sending up a pie. Clementine wore a dress she'd made from that blue fabric, plain but perfect. Levi shaved and wore his father's vest. They said their vows with hands clasped and eyes steady. That night, they sat on the porch after the guests had gone, her head resting against his shoulder. Do you ever wish things had gone different? She asked. He kissed her hair. No. Everything before brought you here. I'd live every mile again to have you now. She reached for his hand and laid it over her heart. Then we're home. Years passed, slow and full. The garden yielded more each season. Clementine's sewing brought in enough for a second room on the cabin, where she kept bolts of fabric and a rocking chair by the window. Levi taught a neighbor boy how to break horses, and in return, the boy's mother taught them how to jar preserves. They aged with grace, not untouched by sorrow, but always together. On quiet evenings, they still read by the fire, her voice steady over the pages, his hand resting on her knee. And when the wind picked up, they leaned into it, knowing it would pass. They built a life from silence and care, from steadiness and choice, and they kept it all their days.